It's been loud out there lately. Too loud to think. Too loud to feel. Sirens, headlines, the dry click of talking heads. It's as if the world's volume has been stuck on maximum. Every screen screams for attention. Every corner of the planet rattles like a pressure cooker. And just beneath it all, a steady drumbeat. Missiles, marches, the old songs of war. We tell ourselves we're making progress, but it feels like something's cracking. Like we've built ourselves a beautiful glass tower and can't stop throwing stones at it. And it makes me start to wonder, what if all the noise, all the division, all the fear was given to us deliberately? Because when you strip it all back, most people still believe in the same things. Life, freedom, love, safety, a future. But somewhere along the way, those quiet truths got buried beneath louder ones. And now, somehow, we're trying to rid the world of suffering by causing more of it. So tonight, here at the Dreamland Motel, we've opened the door to room 62. It doesn't get many visitors, but it's never truly empty. Some say this room has a strange echo, not with footsteps, not with voices, but with memories and impressions. Because once, not long ago, a message was sent to us, not through the wires or satellites or political speeches, but through silence. It came on a warm September day to a dusty schoolyard in a part of the world most of us never think about. It came to children, and they listened. What they saw, what they felt, was real to them. Real in the way dreams are sometimes more honest than the waking world. And what they brought back wasn't fear. It was a warning, and maybe a chance. But we didn't hear them. We were too loud, too busy, too adult. So tonight, let's do something rare. Let's be still. Let's listen. And if you find something here worth holding on to, a feeling, a memory, or a message, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing the Dreamland Motel. It helps us keep the lights on and the doors open for anyone else who might be passing through. And let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, let's begin our exploration of the Ariel School UFO incident. In 1994, on the edge of a quiet town in Zimbabwe, one of the strangest encounters in modern UFO history took place. But you won't hear about it on most top 10 lists. There was no crash, no metal debris, no presidents briefed behind closed doors. Just a group of school children at recess, and something watching them. We're starting this episode with a brief overview, because unless you've gone digging through the forums, archives, or old VHS interviews, you may not have heard this story at all. And if what the witnesses say is true, then this wasn't just a sighting. It was contact, and it came with a message, a warning. 62 children, ages 6 to 12, all standing under the same African sun, all staring at something that should not have been there. They described a silver craft, low and silent, just beyond the tree line. They said beings stepped out, small, thin, and dressed in black. Not frightening, but powerful, unnerving perhaps. And then, somehow, without a word spoken, a message. About the Earth. About technology. About a future in danger. Many of the children were shaken. Some cried. Others drew pictures, trying to capture what they'd seen, trying to anchor their experience to something solid before the adults arrived and reason took over. They told the teachers, they told their parents, they told anyone who would listen. But the world has a habit of dismissing the voices of children, especially when they speak the truth. This wasn't America. This wasn't Roswell. There were no camcorders rolling, no breaking news ticker, just a dusty playground in Ruwa, and 62 kids who never forgot what they saw. And if it really happened, if what they experienced and felt was real, then this changes everything. Not just about UFOs, but about us. About how we treat the people we say we protect, and about what we're willing to ignore when truth comes from the mouths of children. This is about meaning, and if we're brave enough to sit with it, we might see something very old hiding in plain sight. It just needs to be received. Ruwa is not a place most people of the world think about, and in 1994 this was especially true. A small agricultural town just outside Harare, quiet, sun-baked, and sitting on the seam between tradition and transition. Zimbabwe had emerged from colonial rule just over a decade earlier, and though the cities may still have been buzzing with politics and currency exchanges, Ruwa felt distant from all that. Out here, the roads were red and dusty. The fields lay flat and patient. The sky hung wide and high, with a kind of presence to it. The kind that makes you feel watched even when you're alone, like you're living on the surface of a television screen. The Ariel School stood out at the edge of this silence. A private school, modest but well regarded, set among dry grassland and wiry trees. Its classrooms looked out over a brush line that ran all the way to nowhere. It was a multicultural school. Black and white Zimbabwean children, kids from mixed heritage and foreign families. A rare thing, even then. And that's what makes this story so unusual, because it didn't just happen in one culture's imagination. This happened at a meeting point, a place between languages, between beliefs, between what's expected and what isn't. 2 days before the aerial encounter, something strange happened in the skies over southern Africa. A long, fiery streak cut across the night, seen from Harare to Johannesburg. It was beautiful, frightening, unmistakable. Later, it was identified as a re-entry of a Zenit 2 rocket booster, a spent stage from a satellite launch. But in that moment, for many, it was a visitation. Phones rang, radios buzzed. People stepped out of their homes and pointed, and a murmur passed through the region, a kind of invisible tension. And it wasn't just the fireball. Across Zimbabwe, and as far as South Africa, reports had been pouring in. Lights in the sky, low, erratic, moving in sharp angles, changing colour, hovering silently. Witnesses described them as too fast, too stable, too intelligent to be falling space junk. Minor UFO Mania, the newspapers called it. But to those watching the skies, it felt like something more. Like the curtain between worlds had thinned, and something was reaching through it, again and again. At the Ariel School, the days carried on as usual. Assemblies, lessons, breaks beneath the shade of old trees. No one was really expecting anything. But on September the 16th, 1994, there was a charge in the air. Not electric, not stormy, just alert, like the brush behind the fence was watching. The teachers prepared for a routine Friday. The children spilled into the schoolyard, and the sky, so recently lit with fire, was calm again, clear and empty, for now. Because what happened next was no fireball, no distant light streaking across the sky, no celestial flash mistaken for something it wasn't. What the children saw wasn't up there at all. It was here, on the ground. No burning in the upper atmosphere. It was something far closer to home. It began like any other morning break. The children flooded into the open space between the classrooms. Some clustered beneath the trees. Others kicked up dust in a game only they understood. It was hot, dry, late morning. The teachers were inside, gathered for a staff meeting. The children were left to themselves, watched over by the older children and the natural rhythm of the playground. But the atmosphere quickly changed. Some of the children turned toward the brush beyond the fence. A line of trees marked the edge of the school grounds, thick, wild, separating the playing field from untamed scrubland. They saw something silver, shining and motionless, hovering just above the ground. It wasn't large, not by adult standards, but it held presence. The descriptions vary in small ways: a disc, an oval, a round craft with a metallic sheen, but the details that matter stayed the same. It made no sound, it didn't wobble or sway, it just hung there still, in anticipation. And then, movement. Figures emerging from the brush near the object. Small, thin, wearing tight black suits. Their skin was pale, their heads large, their eyes enormous, dark and unblinking. One child described the way they moved. It wasn't like walking, it was more like floating. Another said it looked like they were moving in slow motion, as if time worked differently around them, as if they were gliding through something thicker than air. A few children screamed and ran back to the school. Those that remained stood frozen, somewhere between paralyzed and transfixed. One girl would later say that she tried to look away but couldn't. Something had reached into her mind and anchored her in place. Whatever it was invited her to take a step forward. An invitation that for some reason she couldn't refuse. And then came the message. Not spoken, not even heard, but felt. It arrived like a wave inside her head. Pure meaning. Images, ideas, warnings. Another girl grabbed her hand in an attempt to try and snap her out of this trance, but it had the opposite effect. It brought her along for the ride. The images in her friend's mind were now flooding into hers. Forests dying, machines swallowing the planet. One of the girls said she felt something like sadness, but deeper, like the earth itself was afraid. The children would later struggle to describe it. They knew something had been communicated, but they just didn't have the words. But it stayed with them. Years later it still would. This wasn't a light in the sky, not a story from someone else. This was contact, immediate, personal, undeniable to those who lived it. They were communicating with a being no more than an arm's length away from them. As quickly as the images arrived, they were gone. The figures returned to the craft. The silver object rose slowly, no sound, no fire, just the air bending around it. And then nothing. The brush was still again. The playground returned to its ordinary colour, and the silence, somehow louder than before. For a moment, the children stood there, still wide-eyed, still trying to breathe through whatever had just passed between them. And then, as if the spell had broken, they ran, back toward the school, back to the safety of corridors and chalkboards and adults. They were hysterical, shouting over one another, crying, shaking, pointing back toward the trees. You can imagine the pandemonium. Dozens of children trying to describe something no adult had seen. An experience that, to any teacher listening, could only sound like fantasy. A silver ship, strange beings, a message with no words. The staff tried to calm the situation, tried to get a straight answer. But how do you organise chaos when the truth itself sounds like a dream? What the children received that day was not a lecture, not a statement, not something you could write down and analyse. It was a transmission, through knowing. And what they were left with was weight, a heaviness behind the eyes, a sadness in the chest, a knowing that the world was in trouble. Forests burning, rivers drying, cities falling silent, oceans boiling, and bodies lying in the streets. Technology out of control. One girl described it like a voice inside her saying, "You're not taking care of your planet." Another wept as she tried to explain, not from fear of the beings, but from what she saw through them. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't even anger. It was deep concern, disappointment, grief. These weren't dreams, and they weren't metaphors. They were impressions delivered directly to the soul, bypassing words, bypassing doubt. The kind of message that leaves fingerprints you can't see, but feel for the rest of your life. And for some of the children, that's exactly what happened. Years later, they still speak of it with reverence. They say it was the moment their childhood ended, the moment the world became heavier, more fragile. Because if the beings were real, if what they shared was true, then everything the children had been taught about safety, about separation, about the neat and tidy order of things, was broken. And something far older had stepped in to say, "You're not doing well. You've lost your way, and you don't have much time." They didn't understand the politics of the time. They didn't know the science, but they felt the urgency. And isn't that what a real message does? Not inform, but transform. For a moment, they were alone to deal with the message themselves, the emotion of it, ignored by almost all adults, but those that didn't ignore them could barely understand them. Only a very small select few would be able to understand the children and help them tell their story. Cynthia Hind was one of the only people in Zimbabwe who might have been expected to take them seriously. She wasn't a government official, she wasn't a TV personality. She was a researcher, quiet, determined, and meticulous. Known across southern Africa as the person you called when something strange crossed the sky. And when she heard about what happened at Ariel School, she didn't hesitate. The children had already spoken to their teachers, told their parents, and the parents wanted answers, but the school couldn't provide them. Within 24 hours, the story had spread through the local community like wildfire. Conversation turned into concern, concern into confusion, and confusion inevitably turned into headlines. Tim Leach, a respected journalist working for ITN and the BBC, caught wind of it. He wasn't chasing sensational stories. He'd covered conflict zones, political unrest, the kind of stories that leave scars on your body. But after visiting the school and hearing the children speak, he said, "I could handle war zones, but I could not handle this." It shook him because it didn't make any sense, and because it was real enough to confront even the most grounded parts of him. He tried to help the school navigate the media response, to try and make sense of what happened, or at least to document it carefully. And it was all of this, the flood of attention, the emotional weight of what the children had shared, that drew Cynthia's attention. Cynthia wasn't just a local enthusiast. At the time, she was working with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, a civilian-led global organization that investigates reports of unidentified aerial phenomena around the world. They aren't a government body, they don't hand out answers, but they take sightings seriously, and they document what others often ignore. So when Cynthia stepped onto the Ariel School grounds, she wasn't chasing a headline, she was doing what she'd done for years, listening when others wouldn't. When she arrived, the children were still rattled. Some were tearful. Others had started drawing what they'd seen. The teachers didn't know what to make of it, only that something had clearly shaken them. Cynthia didn't try to shape the story. She didn't feed them words or lead them to conclusions. She listened. She asked questions slowly. She let them talk in their own way and in their own time. She met with them individually, in groups, on the playground where it happened. And what she found was hard to dismiss. Descriptions matched from children of different ages, cultural backgrounds, and languages. Drawings repeated the same features. A silver disc, a figure with the same large, bottomless black eyes. A message that came without sound. Some of the kids couldn't stop looking at the ground when they spoke. Others stared straight ahead, not scared, but dazed. Like something in them was still back there, beneath the trees. Cynthia documented everything. Cassette tapes, notes, sketches, photographs of their drawings. She knew this story would be hard to preserve, that the world would soon rush in and flatten it into a hoax, a childhood fantasy, a local curiosity. But in her recordings, you don't hear fantasy. You hear children doing their best to describe something that didn't fit into any of the categories they'd been taught. And that's what struck Cynthia most. Not how perfectly their stories matched, but how they didn't. Some children saw one figure, others saw two or more. Some even described long hair, others none at all. The shapes, the gestures, the reactions, they varied. But the core of it never changed. Something showed up, something landed. Someone got out and gave them a message. She believed them because they weren't rehearsed, because they weren't trying to match each other, because lying children would have gotten their story straight. These children, whatever happened to them, believed what they were saying. And that, to Cynthia, made all the difference. She preserved their testimony. She listened with care, but she also knew this story had reached a place she couldn't take it alone. To truly understand what had happened to these children, not just what they saw, but what they were still carrying, would require someone with a different kind of expertise. And that's where Dr. John Mack enters the story. When the story reached the wider world, it didn't take long for it to find Dr. John Mack, Harvard psychiatrist, Pulitzer Prize winner, highly respected academic, and by the mid-90s, deeply controversial. Not because of anything he'd done to harm his field, but because of what he'd chosen to believe. Mack had spent years studying people who claimed to have experienced alien abductions. He listened. He didn't label them mentally ill. He didn't try to explain it all away. Instead, he asked what most others wouldn't. What if they're telling the truth? Not necessarily about every detail, not literally in every sense, but what if these experiences are real, even if we don't yet understand how? Mack may well have come across the Ariel School case eventually, but again it was Tim Leach, the BBC journalist, who had visited the site himself, spoken with the head teacher, and seen something in the children that shook him, who first brought it to Mack's attention directly. He didn't pitch a story, he sounded an alarm, that something had happened, that it was serious, and that someone needed to listen. So, Mack booked a flight. A tenured professor from one of the most prestigious universities on Earth, a man who had spent years studying trauma, memory, and the psychology of belief, was now travelling halfway around the world to speak with children who said they saw and communicated with an alien. Let that sink in. He arrived in Zimbabwe just a few weeks after the incident, and he met the children face to face. He didn't question them the way a reporter would. He didn't push for answers the way a scientist might. He simply let them speak, in whatever way felt comfortable for them. In small rooms, quiet spaces, safe places. They told him the same thing they told Cynthia. The craft, the figures, the message. But Mack saw something else too. He saw the impact, the emotional clarity, the kind of conviction that doesn't come from a story made up on the fly. The children weren't itching to retell a carefully crafted story. Many of them struggled to find words at all, and Mack, trained in trauma, in memory, in psychological defense mechanisms, didn't see confusion. He saw children wrestling with something true. In his own words, the children we talked with clearly were talking about a phenomenon that occurred in physical reality. It left virtually no question in our minds. They weren't looking for attention. They weren't even sure they wanted to talk about it. But when they did, they all said the same thing. Maybe not the fine details, but in tone. It happened, it was real, and it had changed something in them. Mack returned to Harvard with his findings. He wrote about Ariel. He spoke about it. But even before the case, he was already facing criticism from his peers. Harvard Medical School launched an investigation, not because he falsified anything, but because he'd taken the claims of abductees seriously. He'd refused to label them as delusions, or the manifestations of the mentally ill. He was eventually cleared, but the stigma remained. In 1995, after a year-long internal review, the dean reaffirmed Mack's right to continue his research, stating he remained a member in good standing. But another comment, widely remembered, summed it up best. The most fundamental right any academic has is the right to be wrong. It wasn't part of the official statement, but it captured the moment perfectly. Mack had wandered off the map of acceptable inquiry. And once you do that, you don't always get welcomed back. But he didn't care about professional safety. He cared about the truth, especially the kinds of truth that don't fit neatly into peer-reviewed journals. To him, the Ariel case wasn't just credible, it was profound. A mass contact event witnessed by children, carrying a warning about the planet, delivered in silence, through feeling, across some invisible threshold of understanding. He called it one of the most important events of its kind, because it didn't just ask us to believe in UFOs, it asked us to rethink what it means to be visited, and who we are when someone comes to warn us. Years passed, then decades. The headlines faded, the journalists moved on, and the children grew up. Some stayed in Zimbabwe, others scattered across the world, to Canada, Australia, the UK. They became engineers, nurses, artists, and parents. But something followed them, not in a physical sense, but in a way you carry something that you can't put down. They didn't all stay in touch, they didn't all keep talking about what happened, but when they did talk, even 20, 30 years later, the story hadn't changed, not in essence nor in weight. It wasn't something they came to believe over time, it was something they never stopped believing. They didn't want it to be true, but they couldn't forget how it felt. Some of them say it shaped who they became, that it made them more aware of the world, more cautious, more compassionate. A few did try to forget, to bury it, to dismiss it as childhood imagination. But that never quite worked. Even those who didn't talk about it for years found themselves crying during interviews, out of a sense that something was left unresolved. Because this wasn't just a flash in the sky or a whisper in the trees. It was an encounter, and encounters can leave marks. To the uninitiated, it would be easy to dismiss these encounters, these messages, this knowing as fantasy. Except it's not unique. Across the world, others have described the same kind of moment. Project Aquarius whistleblower Dan Burrish spoke of knowledge transferred not in symbols or speech, but through direct immersion, like memory, emotion, and experience was being poured into him from outside himself. Jim Peniston, during the Rendlesham Forest incident, described receiving a sequence of binary code, but more than that, a telepathic presence so overwhelming he could barely remain standing. An emotion he had never experienced before, and has not experienced since. And the founder of the Disclosure Project and creator of the C5 contact protocols, Dr. Stephen Greer, has emphasized again and again that contact, real contact, is not just a silent conversation. It's a fusion, two minds overlapping, two realities briefly intertwined. A kind of communication that doesn't just deliver meaning, it shares it. Decades later, people are still trying to interpret what the message meant. Some say it was about climate change, others about nuclear war. Some believe it was a plea, a chance for humanity to change course and to evolve. But there's something deeper underneath the specifics, a grief that doesn't belong to a single issue, a sense that these cataclysms aren't a matter of our future, but perhaps their past, or maybe they are one and the same thing, and we just don't yet have the capacity to understand it. And maybe that's what makes it so powerful, because we're not just talking about CO2 levels or data points, we're talking about how we've forgotten what it means to care for each other and for the world we live in. Somehow, in the minds of these children, the message was not about power, but about responsibility. And the strangest part, it didn't feel foreign. It didn't feel like an outside force condemning us. It felt like something we already knew, something we buried, something we needed to remember. In the years since Ariel, the world has only become noisier, more divided, more volatile. We fight over borders, ideas, over gods. We murder in the name of peace, we wage war to end suffering, and we call it progress. Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking if we still knew what mattered, if we even remembered how to listen. So maybe that's what the message was. Not a prophecy, not a threat, but a reminder of what we already knew but no longer live by. Of all the questions that linger after the Ariel School incident, one echoes louder than most. Why children? Why not scientists? Why not soldiers? Why not the media? Why not someone official? Instead, whoever or whatever was behind this encounter chose a school in rural Zimbabwe, a playground at recess. No cameras, no adults, just 62 children, sitting with an experience that no one believed could happen. And yet, maybe that's the point. Children are unburdened by expectations. They don't filter the world through reputation, politics, or protocols. They don't edit their experience to fit the evening news. They see, they feel, and they tell the truth as best they know how, even if the truth is strange. You can hear it in their interviews. There's no sense of performance and no choreography, just the language of raw experience, spilled out with the awkward sincerity of youth. There's a theory, quiet but persistent, that these kind of encounters are not random, that they're selected. Geography and status are entirely irrelevant. Receptivity is everything. That children might be more open to whatever strange frequency this phenomenon operates on, more willing to receive, more willing to believe. Not because they're gullible, but because they're not yet conditioned to ignore the impossible. This is a tragedy, because when children speak truth, we, as adults, listen with a patronizing smile, then explain it away. Imagination, fantasy, misunderstood stimuli. And by the time they're old enough to be taken seriously, they've learned to keep quiet. The Ariel School event is powerful on its own, but it becomes something else entirely when you realize it's not alone. This wasn't the first time children had reported something extraordinary, and I'm sure it won't be the last. In 1966, nearly 30 years before Ariel, students and a teacher at Westall High School in Melbourne, Australia, witnessed the impossible. A round object, silver or white with a domed top, descended behind a line of trees near the school grounds. Some said it was chased by military aircraft. Others in the surrounding area described a faint purple hue and a craft twice the size of a car. More than 200 witnesses watched it hover, dip, and vanish. Afterward, students rushed to the area. They described flattened grass, burned, boiled, pressed into circles. Some said there were landing marks. Air Force personnel arrived soon after, but apparently reported nothing of interest. The landowner, allegedly overwhelmed by attention, burned the field to keep people away. The story faded quickly, no follow-up, no answers, just another entry in the growing file of things we don't talk about. And just a few years before Ariel, in 1989, children in the city of Voronezh, in the Soviet Union, described seeing a glowing red sphere descend into a park. Out of it came a tall humanoid figure, more than 3 meters high, with strange clothing and mechanical movements. The sighting was reported by dozens of students. Even TASS, the official Soviet news agency, picked up the story. It was strange, it was ridiculed, and then it was forgotten. That's what makes Ariel so haunting. Not just what happened, but how familiar it all seems. Crafts that land near schools, silent observers, a deep sense of being seen. A warning not shouted but felt. And always, children. While many of these events faded quickly into the past, the Ariel event gained traction in part because of who paid attention. Dr. John Mack, Tim Leach, and Cynthia Hind. People who weren't looking to build a case, but who listened. And in that listening, something became clear. This wasn't just another sighting. It was a contact event. A moment of connection across whatever boundaries divide us, from whatever it is that's reaching out. This, in my opinion, begs a more urgent question. What are we not seeing? How many of these encounters have gone unreported? How many stories lost because no one was willing to believe a child? And what happens when we stop listening altogether? Before we ask what it would even mean to believe a story like this, we have to be honest about what makes that belief so difficult. Because the truth is, it wasn't a perfect story. Cynthia Hind, the first person to document this event, was already a believer in the phenomenon. So was Dr. John Mack. They came into the story, yes, with open minds, but also with strong priors. And that does matter. I myself am a believer, but I like to think that in that situation, I would have the ability to stay completely objective. But I've never been there. I've never been on the cusp of having a deeply held belief validated by real-world events. In other words, I can't claim with absolute certainty that I would stay impartial. The children, too, weren't interviewed all at once. They weren't separated beforehand. They had days, even weeks, to talk among themselves, to share impressions, to absorb the reactions of adults around them. Some parents believed their children immediately. Some dismissed them. Others may have offered their own theories, which, consciously or not, could have shaped how the story was remembered. And then there are the inconsistencies. Descriptions of the craft do vary. Some called it silver, others said it shimmered or looked dark and matte. Some children saw a single being, some saw two, some described a figure with long black hair and large eyes. Others saw only a shape, or nothing at all. Some said the object landed, others weren't so sure. A few didn't see anything strange at all that day. This isn't unique to Ariel, however. We saw it at Rendlesham Forest too, where trained military personnel, standing just a few feet apart, recalled completely different events. Different shapes, different colours, different realities altogether. It's messy, uncomfortable, and exactly the kind of thing that makes belief difficult. Because certainty loves clean stories. It loves alignment, clarity, consensus. And this story, at least to some degree, resists that. Human memory isn't a video recording. It's interpretive and emotional. It's affected by time, by fear, by the stories we've already heard, and by the ones we want to believe. So yes, the confidence these children had in their experience doesn't automatically validate the experience itself. But dismissing them because their memories don't all match, that doesn't quite feel right either. Maybe the more honest path is to sit with the contradictions, to say they believed what they were saying, and we can believe them too, without needing every detail to be exact. Because what makes this event powerful isn't its consistency, it's the emotional weight that's lasted long after the lights disappeared. And perhaps finally that brings us to the real question. Not whether their accounts were perfect, but whether their message was real. We've talked about inconsistencies, the conflicting memories, the absence of physical proof, the imperfect conditions of the investigation. And we should talk about those things. Truth isn't served by blind belief. It's served by curiosity, and by holding space for uncertainty, without rushing to conclusions. But even with all of that on the table, the message these children carried still lands with a kind of force that I find hard to shake. They spoke of a warning, planted somehow, like a quiet pressure in their chest. A sense that something is deeply wrong, that the future is in danger, that we're doing harm to the planet and to ourselves. At the time, maybe it was easier to dismiss. Children are impressionable after all. Maybe they heard that message somewhere else and layered it onto the event. Dr. John Mack, after all, was an avid supporter of environmental activism. But here we are, 3 decades later, and what they described sounds less like imagination and more like prophecy. The oceans are boiling, forests vanishing, species disappearing, and we, as a civilization, are preparing for war, as though it's the only language left we know how to speak. And maybe that's what makes this story so hard to hold. It's not the question of whether it happened. It's the realization that if it did, we didn't listen. We buried it in documentaries and forums and ridicule, filed it under interesting or unexplained, and kept moving. Because believing them, really believing them, would mean asking what else we've ignored. It would mean rethinking what qualifies as a message and what counts as a messenger. These children weren't experts. They weren't trained observers. They just saw something and felt something and tried to tell us the best way they knew how. Not with doctrine, dogma, or theory. Just the emotional truth of the moment as it was given to them. Belief isn't about accepting every detail. Maybe it's just about being willing to say, this mattered to someone, this changed something, and I want to understand why. Belief is participatory. It doesn't mean surrendering doubt, just choosing for a moment to sit with someone else's version of reality and take it seriously. If these children were wrong, then they were wrong in a way that accidentally speaks directly to the state of the world today. And if they were right, then maybe this wasn't just a warning. Maybe it was a gesture, an attempt to reach us, before we closed the window too tightly. Not just to warn us, but to remind us that we're not alone, and we're not beyond saving. So no, belief doesn't come easy. Not when the story's this strange, this messy, this inconvenient. But maybe the better question isn't, do you believe it happened? Maybe it's, can you feel the truth in what they were trying to say? Because if you can, then maybe you already do. And there lies the irony of tonight's story. How easily these children were dismissed, laughed at, patted on the head, and told they imagined it. Silly little stories. And yet, when you look at who shaped the course of our world, who has the power, the resources, the education, the credentials, it's not children who chose to build the bombs. It's not children who declared the wars. It's not children who decided the answer to suffering was more suffering. Again and again, it's the wisest among us, the most experienced, the most qualified, the most powerful, who have led us into violence, into collapse, into silence. So maybe the real question isn't, why would anyone believe a child? Maybe it's, why did we ever stop? Tonight's story might leave a bitter taste, a sadness that lingers. But the truth is, we're still here. We're still talking about it. And as long as we are, there's still time to change. Sometimes stories like this ask for answers. Tonight, maybe all we needed was the question. Not, did it happen? But, what would change if we acted like it did? If you're still here, thank you. If you felt something tonight, or found yourself asking unfamiliar questions, consider tapping the like button. Subscribing helps the project grow, and make sure the next time someone knocks on the motel door, you're the first to hear it. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. I have a feeling you're not the only one awake. And finally, as always, if this story meant something to you, maybe share it with someone who'd understand. Someone who, just maybe, has been waiting for a reason to start believing again. Good night from room 62, and thanks for stopping by.
People are saying that the aliens came to warn us something's gonna happen, that something bad is gonna happen to the earth.
I think they came here to try and warn us that the children, because we're young, we've got a long time till we die, to warn us that when we're older, there's something going to happen to the earth.
Yeah, not to pollute, because we're young, we can still prevent it.
Yeah.
How is it different from imagination or dream as you experienced it?
Well, it's definitely reality. And anybody can think that it's not true or that we're making things up, but we know what we've seen and we believe it.